Well, hello and welcome everyone. My name is Inanna Hamati Altaya, and I'm the founding director of gloknos, the Center for Global Knowledge Studies at the University of Cambridge. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Laleh Khalili to our annual lecture series, and I'm really very grateful that she accepted my invitation to contribute to our discussions this year. Dr. Khalili is Professor of International Politics at Queen Mary, University of London, which she rather recently joined after spending 15 years at SOAS, where she has taught hundreds, or more probably thousands of students, the complex and often tragic history and politics of the Middle East, and especially the Arab world. Throughout her academic career, Professor Khalili has developed multiple axes of inquiry to help us better understand how different configurations of power as well as resistance play out in a region that has experienced old and new forms of colonial violence, competing political imaginaries, and a geopolitical position that turns it into a constant locus of international interests in all senses of the term. In her major publications, Professor Khalili has investigated these themes and many others with the enviable ability to calibrate her gaze to the requirements of her subject matter, adapting her intellectual tools and methods to capture the cognitive construction of identity and memory that animate the community subjected to political violence and dispossession, just as well as the institutional and ideological apparatuses that constitute them as legal subjects of violence. Closer perhaps to the topic of her talk today, her most recent book, Sinews of War and Trade, takes a different look at the Arab world and its connections to the global capitalist economy by zooming in and out of these connections and what, but also how they connect. The book illuminates other forms of violence locked into the very infrastructures, resources, and materialities of trade. Every intervention by Laleh Khalili makes her next intervention more desirable, as far as I'm concerned at least. And so I cannot wait to listen to her today. Thank you very much again, Laleh. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Inanna. That was an unbelievably generous introduction, incredibly so. And I usually just, my bio usually just lists, where I work and my books. So I was sitting here sweating with slight embarrassment about the generosity of your introduction. So thank you very much for that. It's interesting because what you were saying was that the talk today kind of draws from my last book, and it does because it is about seafarers. But as I was actually finishing it, and I only just finished the 19,000 words out of which the 4,000 of today comes, when it became clear to me that actually one of the primary concerns of this talk, this longer paper, is actually the ones that I had also with my very first book, which is about what happens when modalities of mobilization give way to humanitarianism. So please keep this in your mind as I'm talking about missions, because this is not a usual talk about missions and missionaries. It is as much about humanitarianism as it is anything else. As Inanna said, I would love to be able to answer any questions that need an urgent answer. I have been working on ships and shipping for so long now that sometimes I'm not entirely, I forget that some of the terminology may not be familiar to an audience that doesn't work on shipping and trade. So please do feel free, if there are terms that I'm using, or or there are things that I'm saying that is unclear, if you could type it in your chat box, and Inanna or Sam will read it out for me, and I'll interrupt myself and I'll talk about that. I'm completely happy to do so. All right, so I'm going to be reading from a paper, so I'm not going to be able to see you as I'm going to have the screen covered. So do yell if there's something wrong and you would like me to interrupt and switch, for example, my Wi-Fi or something like that. Okay, thank you. The talk starts with a story that I read in archives that are as yet uncatalogued. In early 1985, as the tanker wars between Iran and Iraq reached its first of several crescendos, Reverend Ernie Arnold of the Mission to Seamen in Dubai recounted a horrifying incident in his monthly report to the organization's headquarters in London. He described a badly damaged firefighting support vessel, which he believed to have been hit by Iranian missiles as it was towed, after it was towed into the Dubai dry docks. And now I'm going to quote directly from the report. He said, the ship was a mass of twisted and burnt wreckage. The survivors and the 2 dead seamen had been taken off in Bahrain, and the captain was missing, presumed blown into the water. Last Tuesday, 9 days after the boat came to dock in Dubai, I received a telephone call from the local manager of Seafarers International. Seafarers International was established originally in in Liverpool, but it's a big shipping agency. It deals with shipping companies throughout the world. So I received a telephone call from the local manager of Seafarers International who wanted to see me urgently. He then told me that someone had discovered some signs of human remains in the shattered wheelhouse. The wheelhouse being the part of the ship where the captain or the officers essentially direct or guide the ship. And that the captain was somewhere there. In the local situation, there could be no help from either the police or hospitals to help in the recovery. So it fell upon the local manager to do the job. It ended up with him, a doctor, and myself spending about 3.5 hours on Thursday, gathering together what we were able to find by sorting through the ashes and other remains in the wheelhouse. That evening, just before the light failed, we took about 3/4 of a bin liner out to the Indian burning place, crematorium, I guess, and placed it upon a funeral pyre and read the committal service. I felt that God was really with me during this harrowing episode, as by nature, I'm one of the squeamish kind. So I can't go fishing as I don't want to take them off the hook. Yet after an almost sleepless night, as I thought about it, I found that when it came to the crunch, I was able to put my feelings into limbo and get on with the job. I suppose that this is what we call the strength of the Holy Spirit, end quote. During the tanker wars, Iran and Iraq targeted ships lifting oil or serving ports perceived to belong or to be allied with the enemy. There were some 400 ships hit, 60% of them by Iraqi missiles. The harrowing reports from the mission to seafarers in Bahrain and Dubai recording these attacks have a baroque quality. Month after month, the monthly reports brim with seafarers' intense fear of sailing into the Gulf on their tankers, supply vessels, and cargo ships. And the clergymen and laymen working at the mission to seafarers in Bahrain and Dubai are there to provide succor and to do tasks that no one else is willing or permitted to do. For example, carrying ash and remains of those who had been hit on the ship. What is the role of the mission to seafarers today? In what ways has the transmutation of missionary movements into humanitarian organizations been affected by the end of empire, but also by the dominance of unfettered global capital embodied in both transnational and regional firms and corporations? What does faith-based humanitarian work do when its objects of ministry are not those ordinarily portrayed as the abject in need of care, like the displaced and the refugees, the starving, the impoverished, or the outcasts, but workers, people whose plights and dilemmas are as much a product of capitalism as they are of geopolitics? In this talk, I argue that the mission to seafarers, like many other missions whose origins could be traced to imperial Europe and North America, began as tutelary organizations, as kind of a paternalistic organizations, whose institutions depended on the grace and favor of imperial governments and metropolitan corporations in both cordial and contested ways. Their work overseas was from the start intertwined with imperial networks and metropolitan commercial interests. And on the Arabian Peninsula in particular, it was designed to accommodate British naval and civilian seafarers on shore, but was resisted by colonial governments there. After decolonization, a whole series of events, structural events in the world of shipboard labor, like open registries, which already had existed in the 20th century but became predominant in the 1970s, dual wage regimes aboard ships, and various other kinds of legal instruments emerged, and the number of British seafarers declined dramatically. In this period, i.e. from the 1970s onwards, the mission to seafarers have become much broader in their remit, serving a more global body of seafarers, most from the global south. The missions have also become much more NGOized. They've become like NGOs, providing welfare services, particularly to abandoned seafarers, which, while urgently necessary, depoliticizes the very political and economic contexts which have produced the conditions of their abandonment. As I will try to show below, this focus on a category of workers vexes the humanitarian impulses of NGOized missions, while bringing into question the effectiveness of such service when it subjectivizes the seafarers it serves as individuals rather than as collectives constituted in struggle. The research for this project draws on the as yet uncatalogued archives of the Mission to Seafarers, which covers a period from their founding until 2002, which is housed at the Hull History Center up north. Additionally, much of my view and the larger framing of this project has been formed by ethnography aboard container ships and at ports, interviews with a number of Mission to Seafarer representatives in the Middle East, as well as interviews with seafarers and maritime union representatives in a number of seafaring countries and online. I'm on a lot of seafarer message boards. The original kernel of the Mission to Seamen, the Bristol Channel Mission, was founded in the port of Bristol in 1836 by an Anglican minister by the name of John Ashley as part of a larger Anglican revival. If you're at all familiar with the history of Christianity in the UK, there was, and actually elsewhere in Europe, there was a very large-scale evangelical revival that actually started in the 18th century. And one of its primary concerns towards the end of the 18th century was, of course, slavery. But there was a whole lot of other ways in which this evangelical revival actually was also tied in with not only trying to sort of civilize with people within the country itself, but also, of course, it was tied in with imperial expansion overseas. The Mission to Seamen, the original organization, the Bristol Channel Mission, then joined with others to form the Mission to Seamen in 1856, ministering to British sailors traveling to the colonies. The first few places that the Mission to Seamen established its places, guest houses and hostels were Liverpool, Bristol and London. So the big colonial ports, if you will, or the ports from which the sailors left to go to the colonies. It is no surprise that as the empire expanded and consolidated in the latter half of the 19th century, missions ministering to these muscles of empire, a term Frank Brose has used to talk about seafarers, would also grow exponentially. In its early years, the Mission to Seamen began with sailors' homes in Bristol and London, later expanding to other major British ports, Liverpool foremost among them. By the start of the First World War, the Mission to Seamen's churches and institutes surpassed 150, with many of them spread throughout the empire. In the Arabian Peninsula, the Mission to Seafarers' presence tracked the strategic significance of the ports to the British Empire. Along the littoral of Saudi Arabia's vast expanse in the peninsula, the British had two primary colonial arrangements. The first was a direct colony, Aden, which was colonized in 1838 and was at one time the fourth most important coal fueling port in the world after London, New York, and Liverpool. The second British arrangement was that of protection. British protectorates in the Gulf, in Oman, and in southern Yemeni hinterland had been important strategic nodes in the empire, facilitating connection between the metropole and India. Later, of course, much of the holdings of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, that was later to be BP, were strewn on the northern and southern coasts of the Persian and Arabian Gulf, thus making these places also important in a commercial sense and not just in a strategic one. Now, so if you think about those arrangements, keep those arrangements in mind, because the history that I'm tracing actually goes back to those kinds of arrangements. Now, but a little bit on the literature on missions and empire. The literature on the entanglements between Christian missions and imperial networks, ideologies, and anxieties is vast. It's really massive. I mean, there are literally thousands of books and articles out there dealing with various aspects of missions. The debates are largely about the extent to which the missions did the work of empire, as opposed to more ambivalent and contradictory impulses. For example, in a 1966 book that ultimately vindicated the British missionary practice, an Anglican bishop and former missionary to India, Stephen Neal, accepted that, and I'm quoting, "Whatever may have been the beneficent intentions of missionaries, they were in fact the tools of government and instruments of Western infiltration and control." So he admitted that, but said that there was still a place for missions. In some places, the Christianity the missions brought was adopted and indigenized. In others, it was wholeheartedly resisted. In most places, beyond the questions of conversion and subjectivization, missions established welfare institutions that invited the indigenous populations to connect with the church. Education and healthcare were seen as modernizing practices, and I quote, that help provide a crucial legitimizing ideology of development to the colonial state, receiving in turn much needed subsidies from the colonial states. In their classic of the genre, the Komarovs, Jean and John Komarov, have, however, argued that the missionary work in the colonies presented, and I quote, complex dialectic of challenge and riposte, domination and defiance. The position of the missionaries was often complex, and they often occupied, and again, I quote them, an ambivalent location within their own societies as well as in foreign fields. The relationship between the mission to seafarers and the British colonial governments in the Arabian Peninsula, however, was not straightforward. Whereas in many of the other places, in particular in Africa, the colonial governments were very happy to invite missionaries. That was not the case, with the partial exception of Aden, that was not the case in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, in Britain, the various seafarer societies with the church often collaborated with the Merchant Navy Welfare Board, which is a government office that dealt with the Merchant Navy. But in Arabia, the mission faced pushback from the British colonial advisors, bureaucrats, and government ministers. Examples are rife, but I will, and you know, in the 19,000 word paper that I have written, there are several of those, but I'm just going to give one example here from the archives in Bahrain. The discussions about a mission to seafarers in Bahrain go back to 1947 and show the British government of Bahrain reluctant to allow a club for seafarers. And they use Muslim sensitivities to alcohol consumption as an excuse, and it genuinely is an excuse. And I'll explain why in a minute. In a conversation between the Bahraini political agent, Lieutenant Colonel Arnold Galloway, and Rupert Hay, who's the political resident there, the former, the political agent, expresses his distrust of roaming sailors. And I quote, "If the men were allowed to roam at will over the island, Bahrain, I should certainly not welcome an institute being a club for the seafarers established by the mission, since it would be bound to bring with it complications involving public scrutiny. I know from experience in Bahrain that many of the seamen in ships calling here are a rough type and difficult to handle. Their presence would bring in its wake problems of jails, police, importation of drink, sexual immorality, such as were experienced when troops were stationed in the island. While all of this would be offensive to the Sheikh, the solution of these unpleasant problems would devolve on his government and the agency courts, i.e. on the British. Concerns actually may have also been about seafarers carrying with them anti-colonial or subversive or communist materials. There's quite a lot written actually about how intensely, in particular in Bahrain, because there was a major worker community, how intensely the British were actually suspicious of any kind of communists or nationalist seafarers that could bring with them that idea into the island. Another excuse used was the multiplicity and control of the port facilities. Like in Kuwait, there were two different port facilities. One that was privately owned by the oil company. In Kuwait, the oil company was a subsidiary of BP. In Bahrain, the oil company was a subsidiary of what eventually became Chevron, but it was at the time Standard Oil of California. So there was a privately owned oil terminal where tankers came. And then there was a publicly owned, i.e. owned by the island, or a terminal for cargo. And these were often 3 or 4 miles apart from one another in the city. So this also, the fact that there were two different oil ports in the islands was also used as an excuse. As in Kuwait, in the case of Bahrain, the distance between the Sitra oil terminal in Bahrain, which was operated by Bahrain Petroleum Company, and the cargo terminals this was used as an excuse, as a barrier to establishing a club in the cargo terminals, since the vast majority of the ships arriving in port were tankers loading oil in Sitra. This difference in treatment may have also had to do with the fact that at least until the 1970s throughout the Gulf, most of the dry cargo ships carried Indian crews, but many of the tankers carried Europeans, i.e. Dutch, Norwegians, and the British. And so that meant that you could have a club for the seafarers, for the European seafarers, in the tanker terminals, but you would not have a club that was operated by the mission in the cargo port, which was mostly Indian seafarers. So there was a very distinct color line at operation here as well. But with decolonization and the raise of flags of convenience, which is flags of convenience are each ship carries a flag, and the flag that it carries is essentially the flag of the country whose laws it follows. Flags of convenience established in the 1920s and onwards, or open registries, that's the other name given to them, are essentially registries, ship registries that have no relationship to the ship ownership, and which have very lax labor and environmental regulations. The biggest flags of convenience are Panama, Marshall Islands, and Liberia. And so ships, a Greek ship or an American ship or a British ship, could carry the flag of Liberia or Panama or Marshall Islands. And then what it does is that the laws that it follows in terms of whether it adheres to emissions or labor rules or whatever are the laws of those flags of convenience rather than, and it pays less because those are, of course, the wage rates are wage rates related to those flags rather than to British, European, or American flag. Anyway, so with decolonization, the prevalence of flags of convenience and dual wage regimes emerging aboard ships, the dual wage being European officers received much higher wages than global South crew members, often from the Philippines or India, the proportion of European seafarers dropped precipitously at precisely the moment that the British withdrew their forces from the Arabian Peninsula. Up until that point, the British government could depend on the facilities provided by the corporations, which I'll speak about in a moment, and did not see a need for separate services from them. So they essentially allowed the oil companies to provide clubs for seafarers that were going to be there. In exactly the same juncture as the British fleets reducing their domination of the seas in the 1970s, and in the absence of formal British governing organizations, troops, and bases, British corporations and civic and advisory organizations, the mission among them, step forward and bring their work of serving the seafarers. The relationship of the mission with the local rulers is much more vexed after decolonization. We hear less about the local government or the rulers and more about the functionaries, the harbor masters, port managers, heads of police, and others, many of whom are British until the 1990s. There's a double bind constraining the mission officers in this period. On the one hand, they offer humanitarian work no one else will because of the circumscription of unions in the Gulf states, though not in Aden. But they're also there at the grace and favor of the ruling families. In his sweeping synopsis of the entanglement of missions and empire, Norman Etherington has claimed that a map of worldwide missionary activity, even British missionary activity, does not resemble the map of formal empire in any era. In the Arabian Peninsula, one might think that the reluctance of the colonial government to entertain the mission to seafarers may bear this out. But if we thought of empire not only as the structures of government, not only as those formal overweening structures, but also as commercial and corporate interests, then the story of the mission to seafarers actually echoes the empire's commercial interest much more closely. So let me go on ahead and at this stage shift my attention from the governments in the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula to corporations. In his classic article on the limits of the state, Tim Mitchell argues that, and I quote, "the institutional mechanisms of modern political order are never confined within the limits of what is called the state." He says, "These institutions of power are not necessarily," and I quote, "a single totalized structure of power. On the contrary, there are always conflicts between them, as there are between different government agencies, between corporate organizations, and within each of them." So end quote. The contradictory, sometimes contested, sometimes collaborative relationship between missions and corporations has been a part of the forms of modern political order in the Arabian Peninsula. In Britain's empires in India and Africa, the Evangelical Revival, especially in the 19th century, saw colonial commerce as part of God's plan for civilizing Asians and Africans. The civilizing impulse, not to mention the financial needs of the missions, were so intense that the missions even reconciled themselves to working, for example, with merchants that were involved in the opium trade to China. So they set aside some of their moral compunctions because they felt that, you know, this commercializing impulse was doing the work of civilization. But the relationship there was also not always straightforward. While the revivalist Anglican missions were crucial in consolidating the empire and its commercial concerns, some also contested colonial commerce. Now, in the case of, and I'll speak a little bit about what the relationship was, but if there has been a dramatic shift in the work of the mission to seafarers in the Arabian Peninsula, it is in their relationship with firms and corporations, and especially the big beasts serving the empire's energy and transportation needs there. These include British Petroleum, British Tanker Company, no longer existent, Gray Mackenzie, which was a major sort of shipping agency company, and P&O and the like. P&O, of course, was sort of what New York Times called a sinew of empire because it was so important to imperial transportation. For the British government, the attenuation and control of itinerant and mobile populations in these Gulf Emirates and its colony of Aden was a constant concern, and the control of their movement and provision of services to them was often farmed out to corporations. In the oil ports of Kuwait, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi, oil company chaplains provided services to seafarers, even if there was no club or institutes. In Bahrain, the former British political agent there, whose letter I read, Colonel Galloway, had gone on to become the chairman of Overseas Tankship Company in Britain, and in 1956 recommended to the mission that in order to serve the increasing number of tankers there, that the best way to tackle this problem would be for the Church of England chaplain and local shipping agents to consult with the Bahrain government and the local oil company, and having considered all factors, put forward recommendations. So the recommendation from the corporate side was, we're happy to work with you missionaries, but you have to work with us rather than worry too much about the government. So the corporations and the mission were actually working closely on some of this work. The relationship between the missions officers and the oil companies in those early years also extended to the missions officers, to the vicars and chaplains traveling on the tankers of the oil companies, and before these clubs were established, staying in the company guest houses. So often actually, when you look in the archives, the letters will have the company guest house letterhead on some of these 1950s reports. So there was a very intimate relationship. They just received they were just permitted to travel on these freighters. Where the mission finally established the center after the withdrawal of formal British control in the peninsula ports, and I forgot to mention this a little bit earlier. So while these missions were allowed to, by the British colonial government in these places, to establish centers in oil ports, which were controlled by the private oil companies, they only received permission to set up missions in publicly owned ports, the cargo ports, only after independence. So the British colonial government did not want missions in the public ports, which is quite an interesting thing. When the missions finally established the center after the withdrawal of former British control in the peninsula ports, the trustees committees that managed the affairs of the missions were often the local grandees representing large corporations, mostly British. And these were or British advisors in managerial roles there. So this was from the 1970s all the way through the 1990s. For example, the people listed as being interested in the work of the mission in Dubai was almost entirely British, with the exception of a Norwegian representative of Norwegian Seamen's Mission and a Dubaian representative of one of the larger shipping agencies in the city-state. These British folks were managers of shipping agencies, Gray Mackenzie, Gulf Agency, John Harrison Partners Architect, the P&O Company, Dubai International Shipping Company, and the British resident engineer, harbor master, and port manager at Port Rashid, the chief of police, and the advisor to the ruler of Dubai, all of them British. Even the representatives of the two Arab-owned shipping firms present at these meetings, Kanu of Bahrain and Kuwait Shipping Company attending such meetings, were British. The extent to which these entanglements affected the work of the mission is murky. In a great many instances, the mission to seafarer chaplains attempted a reconciliation between the crew members and the ship's officers, and very often also the ship-owning companies. The reports are discreet, but throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the report from the mission to Bahrain and Dubai carries stories where the mission acts to pacify militant or angry seafarers and return them to work. If in the British colonial period and the subsequent decades and years, the work of the mission lined up with that of British corporations, this had begun to change by the late 1980s. Though not exactly adversarial, the relationships today are less cozy. The advisory board of the local missions are not always stacked with British company men. And the NGOization of the mission, about which I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next section, has transformed the grounds of the relationship of the mission and these local companies. With the changes to the incorporation of the mission as a limited company in the early 2000s, becoming essentially a charity, and its shift in attention to a more global body of seafarers, the character of the mission has changed. The intimate connections with British oil and transport companies are gone, not least because the oil companies, British oil companies, do not have as large and looming a presence in the Arabian Peninsula as they did before. The work of the mission has also become more corporatist and liberal, drawing on discourses of human rights and humanitarianism. I will discuss this change now in the section on the relationship between missions and labor. If the work of the mission to seafarers in the Arabian Peninsula was facilitated or thwarted by the colonial and corporate officers, who were sometimes one and the same people, in what ways did the nature of their work with the seafarers and the relationship with these mobile populations of workers change over the course of the years since the end of the Second World War? There has been a shift from tutelary and salvific work, the work of salvation, to more NGO-like delivery of humanitarian aid. And this is the arc of development that is clearly traversed by the mission to seafarers in the Arabian Peninsula. Both the archives and the current practices of the mission to seafarers highlight three specific aspects of ministering to seafarers as a group of laborers. First, the role of race and nationality in determining the work of the mission. Second, the salvific impulse as opposed to secular ministry. And third, and finally, the individuating effects of missionary work as opposed to sort of collectivizing effects. Now, race and nation. One of the most striking changes in the work of the mission to seafarers was the distinct shift from serving British or European seamen to working with a far more diverse and international group of shipboard workers. In the archives, there are one or two missionaries, and you get to know who these missionaries are because you even begin to recognize their handwritings over the course of several years as they're writing reports and letters. But there were one or two missionaries who explicitly carried a patronizing and sometimes downright racist attitudes towards the seafarers. One of them, for example, would complain in the 1970s, the poverty of some of these parts of the world is appalling, and their ignorance is almost as bad. They act like children and have to be treated as such. This is in reference to a bunch of Indian seafarers that were not going to have any of the sort of the bad treatment that were being meted out by the ship's captain. Another would report appalling working conditions for British seafarers aboard a ship that was coming to the Gulf in August and didn't have air conditioning, so it was really terrible working conditions. And then casually added that perhaps Asian seafarers were better suited for these terrible jobs. He literally says that. He writes that. Maybe they should have air conditioning, and if they're not going to have air conditioning, maybe they should just recruit Asian seafarers for these jobs rather than British ones. This particular mission officer was so shocking that in one instance, Sierra Leonean seafarers he had patronized refused to shake his hand, and I quote, "but sent me up to the white boss as I was his man," end quote. So he obviously was honest enough to write about the fact that his racism was registered by some of the seafarers he was supposed to work with, but not reflexive enough to be able to actually think about this. Now, while this particular officer most obviously reflected racist attitudes of British colonial, while this particular missionary most obviously reflected racist attitudes of British colonial officers abroad, many others saw in the international seafarers they served the image of God. One long-serving mission officer in Bahrain concluded a reflection on his Christian service to seafarers with a question: why ships of every nationality? Because God is not an Englishman. He is for everybody. So there is a particular way in which some of them actually saw everybody as children of God. Now, the second aspect of this that I found really interesting was the question of salvation versus service, which is also appears in the title of this talk. I began this talk with the story of a mission officer, Ernie Arnold, who tried to secure some dignity in death for a seafarer who had been killed aboard a ship. As I mentioned above, the story is striking because of the extent to which other institutions, organizations, and actors refused this task. Nobody else would do it. But the story is also striking because it is faith, or what he said, the strength of the Holy Spirit, that allows Reverend Arnold to give the deceased captain a ritual cremation. Perhaps the intensity of the day-to-day work of dealing with abandoned seafarers or those injured at war does not leave much room for religious reflections, but the invocation of the Holy Spirit, or indeed such religious homage, is really rare in the documents. The vast majority of the reports focus on practical problems resolved, bureaucratic issues addressed, and even pastoral and sacramental duties are dutifully enumerated and tabulated, but not reflected on in any kind of a deep or spiritual way. Institutionally, by the 1990s, the terminology around the work of the missions had also changed. In this period, the template for the monthly reports changed to include headings for the different report sections. These different sections were pastoral, i.e. taking sort of counseling work with the people that they were dealing with, sacramental, i.e. performing masses or other kinds of religious service, seafarers' rights, and then general. And general was often had to do, well, we just got funding, we got donations, our minibuses stopped working, things like that. So it's interesting that seafarers' rights, sacramental and pastoral, were separated out from one another. The salvific and sacramental work of the mission to seafarers seems to be most prominent in all of the archives in moments of encounter with communist seafarers in the 1980s, and especially after the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union. There are, for example, accounts of a Ukrainian seafarer being baptized into Anglicanism. There are accounts of Russian language Bibles being passed out. There are accounts of discussions about God with a lot of Russian former Soviet seafarers. So that's quite interesting that it's often these guys that are being converted. But by and large, the lack of religious top thumping bears out the lament of many in the church about the secularization of their vocation. Finally, the area, and this is where I found the most interesting kinds of tensions in the work of the mission to seafarers, was the area where the work of the missions officers is absolutely most needed, but also vexed by the fundamental and inherent character of missionary work, is attending to those instances of abandonment or hyper-exploitation aboard ships. The process of the process of NGOization of the mission to seafarers between the 1990s and the early 2000s has seen a significant shift for the missions from dependence on corporations and firms to a closer working relationship with the International Transport Workers Federation, a global union. Many of the reports are filled with, and as this process of NGOization has happened, there's also an increase in the ways in which seafarers' rights are viewed by the missionaries. Many of the reports are filled with enraged and frustrated accounts of injustice against the seafarers, and a correct diagnosis of the exploitation of seafarers by the shipping companies and with the acquiescence of the governments, which, and I quote, hide behind the protocol of ships' flags to avoid taking action to support their nationals. The more recent work of the missions to highlight the plight of abandoned seafarers, to advocate for them not only locally, but vocally and on the pages of international newspapers, similarly echo what a global union may have done to alleviate the situation of the seafarers there. I don't know if you guys did read The Guardian, but The Guardian has, over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, had a number of really fantastic articles dealing with abandonment in the UAE, the abandonment of seafarers, usually Indian seafarers in the UAE. And the person who's actually placed these articles is the mission to seafarers representative in the UAE. So that's a very interesting way in which he's engaged in labor advocacy work that you would usually expect from like a global union rather than from a missionary organization. But in earlier periods, the missionaries or the local chaplains seconded to the missions to seafarers seem to have had more sympathy for the seafarers if they displayed meekness and deference. A number of reports recount the mission officers facilitating reconciliation between seafarers and abusive officers, and resolution of labor disputes where the mission officer counsels the workers to bend a little, and which in the end benefited the shipping company more than the seafarers. In these cases, the excuse is, but they know what they were signing on to. In some reports, disputes and worker strikes are blamed on one or two hardliners who are winding up the others. So it's always blamed on a kind of an agitated outsider. What often distinguishes humanitarianism from autonomous and collective claim making by agential actors is the latter's insistence on the abject object of humanitarianism. So the former's insistence on abject objects of humanitarianism. They want a grateful, though piteous recipient of the munificence of Christian charity. Such humanitarianism, whether cast as salvific or not, focuses on resolving the problems of individual seafarers, something a scholar of religious work in Dubai has called therapeutic individualism. Such neoliberal notions of workplace justice can also be seen in, for example, Seafarers' Happiness Index, which is produced by the mission. The index, which is produced 4 times a year, is supported by shipping and insurance companies and gives an indication, and I quote this from their website, gives an indication of the concerns facing seafarers on a quarterly basis, offering ship managers an insight into well-being on board. Happiness, as in other contexts where it is intended to bolster economic productivity, has become a technology of governmentality here, which is deployed by the mission to seafarers. So their work is extremely contradictory. On the one hand, you have got this one guy in Dubai who's being an amazing advocate, and on the other hand, you have this happiness index, which is a kind of a neoliberal technology of governmentality. So in conclusion, like most people writing about the mission to seafarers, I will also or any kind of missions, I will also declare that it is difficult to tell a singular story here. What is clear is that the mission serving seafarers are unique in many ways. On the one hand, they were once salvific organizations whose positionality vis-a-vis workers and management often generated unresolved tensions. In this, they resemble land-bound industrial missions. If you would like to ask about that, I'll be very happy to explain what industrial missions were, whose notions of service and welfare arose not out of radically egalitarian impulses, but out of pious attachment to gospel and its preaching about the abject and the itinerant. The question that arises then is, what role can such institutions play in a world in which workers are ever more precarious, ever more hyper-exploited, ever more itinerant and abject? Will religious humanitarianism and service bring with it succor, but at the cost of pacification? Or will it be able to adapt to new modalities of mobilization? Thank you.